Okay, so I'm here to take this discussion in a slightly different direction. My talk is not really going to be about the open web or how to use it. Instead, I kind of want to take a step back and deconstruct the very concept of the open web as we understand it. And then in its place, I'd like to construct a more radical idea of openness in order to show the difference between what the web is now and what the web could be. So I should start by saying that I was quite surprised when I was asked to speak at this event. I'm a writer and I write about tech, but I don't really talk about the open web or digital literacy or pedagogy. Instead, my main focus is on the political economy of tech, which I approach from a very critical perspective. And a lot of my writing over the last year has been about the downsides of technological development being driven by corporations. Not only in terms of them making all the decisions and accruing all the wealth, but also in the way they shape the ideological landscape. The tech companies that have profited massively from the emergence of the internet, which are now, as we know, among the world's most valuable companies, they've become so naturalized that it's hard for us to imagine a world without them. And I think that constrains our imaginations when we try to reimagine the web. It limits our understandings of what's possible. And so when people talk about the open web, I instinctively kind of just wince, not because it's a bad thing. I think it's a great thing, and I don't think a closed web is in any way desirable. It's more that I think the open web, as it's currently formulated, is not really enough. So I guess that's why I've been asked to speak here. It's useful to have a critical voice sometimes. And so I want to investigate the concept of openness and identify its limitations as a progressive ideal. Specifically, I think we need to understand how the term gets co-opted by corporations, which results in the term being watered down in a way that limits its radical potential. And there's this book from 2013 called The People's Platform by Astra Taylor, which I highly recommend, by the way. And there's a quote that talks about the limitations of openness in the context of Facebook, which likes to justify itself by saying that it's all about making the world more open and more connected. And so Taylor talks about the history of the term openness, which originally came from the world of software production. The designation open source was invented to rebrand free software as business-friendly, foregrounding efficiency and economic benefits, open as in open markets, over ethical concerns, the freedom of free software. And in keeping with this transformation, openness is often invoked in a way that evades discussion of ownership and equity, highlighting individual agency over commercial might and ignoring underlying power imbalances. Now, I didn't always believe this. I had a bit of an unusual journey to get to my current perspective, which included a long detour through the land of techno-optimism. See, these days, my focus is on writing about tech and the problems I see in tech, but I only started doing that quite recently. Before that, I was a software developer. I started coding when I was 12, and I spent most of my adolescent years on my computer building websites or just talking to people in IRC. Guys remember IRC? Yeah. I studied computer science in uni. I did a software engineering internship at Google in San Francisco, and I went to tech conferences and worked on open source projects in my spare time. And I would read Hacker News every day. I was totally bought into that lifestyle. And so I was basically all set up for this extremely lucrative career in Silicon Valley. And after I interned at Google in 2013, I was given a return offer, which meant that I could go back to uni, finish my final year, and then immediately start working full-time at Google in the Bay Area. And everybody kept telling me that this is such an amazing opportunity and I should just be so happy about it. But I wasn't really excited about it, and I guess it's partly because my experience during my internship itself was kind of disillusioning. And yeah, the pay is great, the perks are great, and you do have some autonomy, but it was also really stifling. And more than that, it just felt really hollow and empty, just kind of devoid of any real purpose. I felt like this cog in a giant machine that was too big to understand and too big to control. Where was it going? Were we actually making the world a better place? I didn't know. And I kind of just had to take it on faith. And everyone I talked to seemed to think that it was a good place to work, that this was the best that you could do with the skill sets that we have. And I was like, okay, sure, they have to be right. But I think there was always part of me that wanted something more. I wanted some moral purpose beyond trying to just increase shareholder value. And its motto at the time was, don't be evil, which they've since removed, by the way. But I was starting to realize that not being evil is not the same thing as being good. And I just wanted some sort of higher purpose for my programming skills than being just another employee at a huge corporation that had long ceased to have any laudable social goals. And maybe that was silly, maybe that was impractical, but it was something that I'd picked up during my time in the open source community as a teenager. I fell into open source when I was just starting to get into programming, and I loved just the whole community around it, and I fell really hard. I read books like Lawrence Lessig's Free Culture, Richard Stallman's Free Software, Free Society, Eric S. Raymond's The Cathedral and the Bazaar, and I was a true believer. The ideas behind the free software movement, they just felt so obvious to me, right? Like intellectual property is obviously bad. Openness, sharing source code and knowledge, is obviously good. Corporations like Microsoft or Apple that relied on proprietary software and keeping users in the dark were the enemy. And so I spent a lot of time in the open source community, writing code, helping out other people, going to meetups. But eventually it dawned on me that the movement as it existed in reality didn't quite live up to the ideals that I'd fallen in love with. And there's this conference that takes place every year in Portland called the O'Reilly Open Source Convention, which is meant to be a celebration of free and open source software. I first went in 2011 and then again in 2012 on behalf of this one open source project that I was volunteering with. And the second year I went, I was pretty shocked at how much more corporate sponsorship there was. I remember Microsoft had this huge booth in the middle of the hall, and they had this drone flying around, and they had salespeople who would come up to you and be like, you should use our product. And lunch was sponsored by some customer relationship management software that was not open source. And the physical area that they devoted to open source projects got smaller. Like there was less space, there were less projects there. And so theoretically, the conference's reason for existing was just shrinking. And it was really unsettling for me. And I was starting to realize that the open source movement, which was ostensibly about openness and freedom and production outside the corporate form, was being co-opted by these very corporations. And all that, the open source software movement was really all that remained of the free software movement, the part of it that had gone mainstream. And I was realizing that it wasn't really about agency, it was about refuge, right? It wasn't about challenging corporations, it was kind of about hiding from them. And at best, it was about carving out this little spot outside the realm of the corporation where you could talk about how bad corporations were and how proprietary software is bad, but you couldn't really do much about it. And you can't feed yourself on anti-corporation sentiment. The open source project that I was spending most of my time with, we got money from donations a little bit, but mostly from advertising, right? And most of the work was provided by volunteer labor. So people like me who lived at home and didn't really need money, or people who had day jobs at big corporations who were spending their evenings working on it. And the point is that it wasn't sustainable to try to avoid corporate money. And if you look at how what's happening today and how open source is funded today, well, a lot of development is funded by these huge corporations. They're either paying developers to work on them directly, or they're funding, giving donations. And Microsoft, right, long the enemy of open source, recently announced that it was open sourcing its entire patent portfolio. So there are two ways of looking at this, right? One is to think, great, open source has won. Even Microsoft has been convinced openness is a virtue that has prevailed and we should all celebrate. But I think there's a fundamental incompatibility here. I don't think corporate sponsorship and acceptance of open source is something to celebrate. If anything, it's a Pyrrhic victory. If you take the ideals behind free software to their logical conclusion, you see a glimpse of a radically different world, one where you don't need corporations like Microsoft to donate their patents because they never had the ability to create those patents in the first place. When you don't, a different world where you don't have to beg corporations for scraps in order to fund the open source projects they rely on, because these corporations weren't allowed to amass that wealth. But that world never materialized, and I think the reasons for this failure are instructive when it comes to the idea of the open web more broadly. Because openness on its own is not enough when you're on an unequal power terrain, as Astra Taylor is saying in that quote. Unless it's directly aimed at the direction of power, unless your goal is to challenge power, then you're just going to merely entrench existing power relations. If the goal is to coexist harmoniously alongside corporations whose entire commercial advantage comes from being closed off, then your movement will become subsumed. And so the question is, what exactly is the goal of openness? Openness as a means of achieving what exactly? Achieving freedom? But freedom means different things to different actors. And not all freedoms are compatible with each other, right? My freedom as a hobbyist may come into tension with the freedom of a corporation. My freedom as a consumer might come into tension with other people's freedom as producers and as workers. Now, I want to explore this last point in more detail because it's one that frequently gets lost in conversations about the internet. When we talk about the internet, the benefits it brings, the dangers of the internet, it's almost always within the context of consumption. We talk about Wikipedia giving us instantaneous access to knowledge. We talk about Twitter and Facebook and email giving us the ability to communicate with people on the other side of the world. We talk about the fact that it's an equalizing potential for social mobility, the fact that anyone who has access to a computer can learn to code and get a six-figure job in the Valley. We talk about the wave of entrepreneurship and innovation that it's spurred, the way people can unleash the power of mobile apps and the internet to create billion-dollar companies in a really short amount of time. But rarely do we talk about the other side of the story. When we glorify what the web has brought us as consumers, we obscure what the costs have been for producers. The benefits that the web has brought have come at a cost, and it's not a cost that's evenly spread. So then let's take a look at the hidden abode of production, as Marx would say. Time to look at the material costs of the new information age that we've been ushered into, which means looking more closely at the corporations that have benefited from the internet, that have built their empires from privatizing more and more of the web in exchange for some addictive smartphone apps. And for most of us in the room, our interactions with the web are primarily at the surface level, the level of the consumer, right? If we interact as producers, it's as producers of content. We build software, we send emails, we write content. Our experiences are mediated by this very high-level form of interaction, and that makes us forget what's actually happening underneath, the very real exploitation and inequality that has been enabled by the internet. And I really like this tweet, which I'm about to show you, which I think explains it pretty well. So that's a scene from The Matrix, and it kind of shows how they actually did like the stunts in The Matrix. You know, there were people holding them up. And I think that's a really good analogy for what's happening with tech. So if we look at the companies that have gone from, you know, dorm room like entities to global behemoths by capitalizing on the internet, all of these companies are, to some extent, built on a global empire of underpaid labor. I mean, for some companies, it's really obvious how. If you look at Apple's $1 trillion valuation, that didn't come out of thin air. It wasn't created by Steve Jobs and Tim Cook because they just dreamt it up, right? And if we focus on the stereotype of tech wealth as being created by geniuses at the top, then we're kind of falling prey to this sleight of hand, one that distracts us from the exploitation of the powerless that's happening underneath. The internet may have brought untold wealth to Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos and opportunities for countless other people, but that wealth isn't trickling down to those who actually created it, and the opportunities are not evenly distributed. The coltan miners in the Congo, factory workers in China, warehouse workers at Amazon, Uber drivers who work under punishing conditions, they're not being featured on the cover of Time magazine or giving TED Talks about making the world a better place. And when it comes to the more virtual companies like Google and Facebook, well, their profits don't come out of thin air either. They come from advertising, which means getting a cut of the cost of commodities that are actually being sold, which means they too are complicit in these global neo-imperialist chains of commodity production. All of this is to say that the web isn't some cloud floating above the physical world of resource exploitation and sweatshop labor. Instead, it's more of an extension of these same principles into the digital domain. And if you look more closely, you see that basically all these companies are complicit, right? This event is supposed to be a fringe event for MozFest. Well, where does Mozilla get their money from? Most of the revenue comes from Google, which means through partnering with their search engine. And that's not to say that these companies are inherently evil or that we should hold them responsible for this world that they've created. Like, they didn't create this world, right? Like, they're not the ones who created these global value chains. But they've only been able to accumulate as much wealth as they have by virtue of their position at the top of these global value chains. Even if they weren't originally responsible for them, they're profiteering from them in a way that is entrenching them. And I'm sure this is obvious to some people here, but for me, as someone who kind of grew up drinking the tech Kool-Aid, who idolized people like Elon Musk, it honestly came as a bit of a shock. Because I always thought technology was supposed to be about progress and freedom and emancipation. Because it was for me, that's the thing. But the overarching function of technology in a capitalist system is a lot more prosaic. It's an outlet for surplus capital, a way for capital to make returns by coming up with more and more inventive commodities for people to consume. And at the same time, it's a way to squeeze more surplus value out of labor through enhanced surveillance and automation. The web has merely become the latest territory to be enclosed by capital. And now returning to the concept of the open web, I think once you understand the current landscape, once you see how it's been captured by corporations that commodify more and more of the web in order to enhance shareholder value, you see that the conception of openness by itself is not enough. It's not enough to build in a kind of sheltered microcosm in which we take refuge, one that exists within the gaps of the system. Because capital has no imperative other than to expand, and in the process, it will warp the very idea of openness into one that suits its agenda. Openness becomes a corporate buzzword, a way to justify increasing wealth and power, and in the process, it loses all meaning. So to conclude, we're living in an era of stark wealth inequality, and the internet has not ameliorated this problem. In fact, it's made it worse. But that's not because of something inherently wrong with the internet. It's because of the social and economic system in which it exists. a system that celebrates private enterprise and dismisses the concept of the public good, a system that tolerates or even glorifies extreme inequality as a prerequisite for innovation. The beauty of the concept of the open web is that it lets us imagine an entirely different system, characterized by ideals other than profit maximization, ideals based on sharing and community and creating social value. But the corporations that are currently controlling and profiting from the web, they will only allow that to happen on their own terms, insofar as it doesn't interfere with their profit margins. And there's a point at which the needs of corporations cannot be reconciled with the driving ideals behind the open web, where the two cannot coexist. And that's the point where we have to decide, do we want to allow these corporate monoliths to commodify more and more of our digital lives while heavily exploiting their workers where they think they can get away with it? Or can we fight our way to a world without them, where the web truly is for everyone? Thank you.